Hello, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Hay Festival Book Club. I am Danny Robbins, and I'm joined by one of my favourite authors, Michelle Paver, tonight. I cannot wait to ask Michelle lots of questions. We're going to start just with a few little bits of information, just to remind you that Hay Festival is a charity with year-round activities to connect audiences with artists. So thanks to all of you and everybody for their continued support and engagement. Dark Matter, Michelle's book, is the Hay Festival Book Club pick for October, and copies are available for purchase on the Hay Festival website, or you can buy a copy from your local bookseller. And Hay Festival Book Club is supported by Unwin Charitable Trust, and you can find past events, lots of previous talks with authors available to rewatch free online now. And this talk will also be available online after this. So I should introduce Michelle. I said she's one of my favorite authors. I think she is one of the greatest ghost story writers we have in the UK right now. She was born in Central Africa and came to England as a child. After gaining a degree in biochemistry from Oxford University, she worked as a solicitor before giving up the law to write full time. Her books include the internationally best-selling Wolf Brother series for younger readers and the acclaimed supernatural novels Dark Matter, Thin Air, and Wakenhurst. And Michelle, your new book, Rainforest, came out last week as well, didn't it? But we're here to talk about Dark Matter, released now on the 15th anniversary of its original publication. I guess I am here to talk to you as a fan of your work, as a fan of ghost stories, as somebody who creates ghost stories myself through my play 222, A Ghost Story, and my BBC series Uncanny as well, the podcast and TV series. So I would say, as somebody who loves ghost stories, Michelle, that this is a very good ghost story, Dark Matter, one of the finest ghost stories I've read. Sorry. So I'm going to start by asking you, what do you think makes a good ghost story? As somebody who can write a good ghost story, what do you think makes a good ghost story?
Oh, wow. Hello, Danny. And gosh, yeah. I think a good fictional ghost story. Well, first thing is, in my view, it's got to scare you. It's got to scare the hell out of you. But I do make a distinction between a ghost story and horror. Personally, I don't want it to gross you out, or it might do, but in a subtle way rather than in your face splatter sort of way. I mean, I think, there are elements that when I was writing Dark Matter, which was my first ghost story, I did think about it quite forensically, which sounds strange because I don't normally analyze, a genre or anything. I don't think about genres, but ghost stories are so difficult to write. I think atmosphere is incredibly important. I mean, it doesn't have to be a haunted house. I mean, it can be a haunted cabin in the Arctic, or it could be down the tube, the underground. It's got to have atmosphere. I think personally, the ghost should have intention. I know there's, what is it? Stone tape theory. I mean, I think of it as place memory because that's how, the old fashioned version. I don't find that as frightening as an entity which has intention.
So that differentiation between the idea of a place playing back something or something that is
Yes,
literally there, then.
exactly. A sort of echo, that's the stone tape theory, that, well,
Mm.
that would probably be scary to experience it, but not as much as something that you can't see that has an intention. And if it's malevolent, personally, I like the ones which are malevolent. Let's just make it as scary as we possibly can. And I think the final thing that to me is really important is that there's a sort of, you rely more on suggestion. There's a subtlety to a ghost story than, as I said, in your face horror. But that's really difficult to achieve because if you leave too much out, you start irritating the reader. And they start saying, well, when do we find out who this ghost is? But if you put too much in, then you're telling too much, and then there's the mystery's gone, and then it's not scary. So it's really hard, but that's what I
Yeah.
think.
No,
Yeah.
that's a great answer. I think, you said this was the first ghost story you read. Did that come from a love of ghost stories? Were you a big consumer of ghost stories prior to writing your first book?
Oh, completely. Yeah. I mean, I've loved ghost stories practically since I could read. Um, uh, I mean, I remember the first one. It was probably E. Nesbit, Man Size in
Right.
Marble.
Yeah, yeah, a great story.
Amazing story about sort of haunted effigies, and when I think it was 6 or 7, I read an abridged version. And I remember I did lie awake in a cold sweat. And the next morning, I was actually thrilled because I'd read about cold sweats and I'd never experienced one. And I thought, wow, this was fantastic. So yeah, that got me completely hooked. And that was in Ghostly Gallery, Alfred Hitchcock, which I still own. It was my first puffin, which I saved up for, with my pocket money, and it had some really good, abridged versions. And ever since then, yeah, totally, I've got shelves and shelves of ghost stories, plus the quotes real, ghost story hauntings as well. So may I just say, I'm a huge fan of Uncanny, absolutely massive. And I can't really listen to it without the lights on. I've tried, but because I live on my own in a house where a Victorian novelist who wrote ghost stories died, so I have to be
Goodness
a
me.
bit
Oh,
careful.
wow. Okay,
Um,
okay.
but yeah, I love Uncanny. So yeah,
Oh, well,
all
thank you.
ghosts, all manner of ghost stories, hauntings. Yeah, probably Team Skeptic, but
I love the fact that we spook each other out. That's great. And yet,
yeah.
this is the first time we've met, but we've been sort of remotely scaring each other. I'm very struck, having read a few of your books now, I'm very struck by the fact that you have certain recurring themes, I would say, like, dark matter and thin air, and your new book, Rainforest, deal with expeditions. You've got that sort of sense of a sort of battle against nature and of loneliness and kind of
Yeah.
escaping a past. I mean, do you feel that you have certain itches that you want to scratch as a writer? Are there certain aspects of the human condition that particularly fascinate you and you find yourself returning to?
It's funny. I only really realize what a story is about when I've written the first draft and done a lot of planning and work and got to know the characters and things. So sort of themes and things tend to, certainly never think of them beforehand. I wouldn't be able to, but they sort of arise. But I do think that the possibility, the capability of the human brain is what I keep coming back to. I mean, even with the Wolf Brother books, it was sort of, what would be going through the mind of a Stone Age person or a Stone Age society? How would they view a thunderstorm or a flood or, something awful, or nice, but mostly awful. And the same thing, if you're marooned in the Arctic on your own in a cabin, what's that going to do to your mind? Or is there really a ghost out there? And so I think, the only way I can write ghost stories, and probably what interests me about ghosts is it all in your mind, or is there something out there? And which is more frightening, actually? Because if it is all in your mind, that's pretty terrifying. But then on the other hand, if there really is something that was dead and is still around, that's pretty awful as well. So.
I think that's absolutely true. Like, I think for me, the scariest ghost stories are always the most real as well. And I think
Yeah.
that's one of the things that leaps out at me from dark matter, just how real this feels. And yet it takes place in a location where very few of us have been and probably will ever go to. It's a very remote and unique location. So I'd love to know more about your process of making this feel so real. How did you research this incredible Arctic location?
Well, I'd been to Svalbard, as it's now called, but I call it Spitsbergen in the book. I'd been up there, these islands, north of Norway, long before I had the idea for Dark Matter. I'd just gone on a trip, one of those sort of boat trips, a week or 10 days round it in the summer. And I'd been struck by these. Occasionally, you come across, well, it's very, very remote, obviously, and this was the time of the midnight sun, very atmospheric, the threat of polar bears, but also remains of trappers' huts, incredibly desolate, an isolated hut. And the next stop, if you head north, is the North Pole, sort of thing. And then I'd read stories about people going mad and, just the loneliness. And yet, what sort of person would go up there? So I didn't have an idea for a ghost story, but I took lots of notes because that's what I do. And then I was finishing the last, as I thought then, book 6 of the Wolf Brother books, thinking, what am I going to do next? And I thought, I just wanted to write a ghost story. And I actually thought, wow, this is going to be really hard. Um, a full-length ghost story, because there aren't many. I mean, I love The Haunting of Hill House, but there aren't many that I really, really love. And then gradually the idea came, and it was gradual. And then I did a lot of research, library research, and managed to find some really useful sort of 1935 Oxford Spitsbergen expedition. Lads go to Oxford, go to Spitsbergen. So that was helpful. But then, of course, I
These were
had
like
to,
real life versions of Jack
yeah,
and Gus and
yeah.
Algernon.
And that was brilliant, because, they really did take Royal Doulton china up there, and fur traveling rugs, because they were Oxford upper class chaps. I mean, very tough. And that was great. And then I think the Army and Navy catalogue in the British Library for 1932 was amazing. So things like that to get the reality. What are they going to eat? What are they going to wear? Those sort of details, couch it in reality to make the reader believe in the ghost. And I wrote the first draft on the basis of that book research, and my notes from the summer. But then I thought I'd better go up there in the winter. Um, and that was one
Daunting.
of, yeah, well, yeah, it wasn't too bad. I mean, I wasn't, you don't camp on your own in Spitsbergen because of the polar bear. You can't, you're not allowed to, quite rightly. So it was actually it was one of the best research trips I've ever had. I had a week. No, it was 2 weeks. That's right, 2 weeks. At the start of the polar night, because I wanted to see this sort of false dawn
Mm.
when you think the sun's going to rise and then it doesn't. And it was amazing because by then I knew Jack. I knew what was going on. The first draft was rubbish. It really wasn't scary at all. I got all the details right, but where was the scariness? But then when I went up there, and I mean things like, for example, the cabin. I'd worked out. I had a plan of the cabin, but in my mind, it looked like something from an IKEA catalogue. Beautiful pools of light, and it was all sort of pine and everything. But we went to a cabin. We'd sort of snowshoed along, a group of four of us, I think, with a guide with a gun and a husky. We went into a cabin to just make a cup of tea, sort of thing. But I realised that in the Arctic, you don't just leave the lights on, particularly in 1937, when dark matter was set, because if you go nip out for half an hour and you leave the lantern on, it might burn down and then you're going to die. So you're going into this cabin and it's dark and cold, you know, things like that, basic things. And then, this strange feeling that, and I've never heard it described in a book, but I was snowshoeing, we all were, and I was at the back, obviously, because I'm trying to sort of soak up the atmosphere, but not staying too far away because of the polar bears. But it really sounded as if there was a pair of snowshoes following me. And there wasn't. It must have been an echo from my snowshoes, but I have no explanation for that. But it was just great. You can't make things up like that. You can't get that from a book.
I think it's really interesting hearing you talk about the fact that the scare factor in the book came from that trip, and it
Yeah.
made me think also when you mentioned just before about the daunting nature of writing a full length ghost story, because there has been at times this kind of conventional wisdom that the best ghost stories are short stories, and I think you are living proof of that not being true. But
Thank you.
actually. People have always said, ghosts outstay their welcome. It's got to be short and
Mm,
sweet and scary. But actually,
mm,
I think to make a good long form ghost story, you need threat to come from places other than the ghost. You can't. Your ghost will quickly run out of steam unless you have some real world jeopardy and threat. And I think that's what you get brilliantly in here in Dark Matter in the Arctic. You get this environment which is another enemy, another adversary, isn't it?
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think it's right. I've never thought of it as a sort of an absolute requirement, but it certainly helps to create a sense of menace. I think it's also a difficulty because you've got to keep a sort of balance. I remember thinking about a lot about polar bears when I was writing Dark Matter because, they are terrifying. Unlike black bears, and I've had encounters with those, you can persuade a black bear, to wander off and no harm done. If you meet a polar bear, you're probably kippered because you are prey. So I decided with dark matter, if I had a polar bear sort of prowling around the cabin, that's going to be too much. But you don't need to anyway. I mean, we had an encounter. He has an encounter with polar bears sort of at a distance on the way up to Gruhuken, but it's the thing the threat inherent in the Arctic when you're up there, and I've had that when I've sort of been on a solo hike in Greenland, is if you make a mistake, it could be fatal. And it doesn't have to be a big one. The environment is the threat. I mean, there was once, I got back to my cabin, which was part of, a group of cabins, but my hands were so cold that I couldn't actually use the key to get in my cabin. Why on earth I'd locked it in the first place, I don't know. I'm a Londoner, so you lock things. But something like that, it's a basic mistake. I mean, there's that Jack London story, to build a fire. His hands are so cold that he can't use the matches or make or use his flint strike fire or whatever. And he, you
Did you
can
find
die
yourself
that
feeling
way.
frightened in that moment? I mean, does some of the fear that Jack feels in the book come from fear that you felt in moments in that trip?
Oh yes, definitely. I mean, with me, I didn't get into luckily life-threatening situations, but I got on the edge. You know, I've been lost. I mean, I can be lost, get lost in a restaurant. I have no sense of direction whatsoever. But um, I have been lost briefly. I have had slightly dodgy encounters with musk oxen, um, which I thought were boulders from a distance, and things like that. And oh yes, and there was the edge of a glacier in Greenland that it was the sort of moraine, the lateral moraine, and it was very unstable. And I really wanted to get close to this glacier, and I was all on my own. And then I thought, yeah, if this thing collapses, they're not going to find you. You know, how do I know it's not? Things like that. It really doesn't take much. And so I suppose it's interesting. I think that's probably what I do like about these sort of, I mean, one reader called these stories survivalist gothic, which I love. Um,
I think I definitely feel like it's about people pitted against various foes, pitted against a
yeah,
potential
yeah,
supernatural foe, but pitted
yeah,
against an environment that kind of is challenging and potentially frightening,
yes.
and also pitted against themselves as well. I mean, Jack's kind of struggle with himself is a big part of this book, isn't it?
It is, and I do like that. I like to have, I won't say it's a formula, but I mean I like to have the protagonist having some problem that
Hmm.
they're working out, whether they're aware of it at the time or whether they've gone there to escape something. Um, yes, I like that. That it makes them sort of more interesting, I think. And then also, I think these wild places, these very remote places, extreme far north or up a mountain in thin air, that sort of thing. Um, you're alone. I mean, I always try to get the protagonist alone, and then you really it's not. Sometimes it's that they feel pitted against the environment, or they don't think they are, and then they think, yeah, Jesus, I just need to survive. But that puts all sorts of stresses on your brain. And as I said, I'm just interested in what happens to you. I mean, I've been up mountains, lone mountains in Norway, and it just gets a bit dodgy at night, or when you're coming down and you haven't got enough time. I remember coming down one sort of boulder field in North Norway, and I had to get down at a certain point where I was meeting someone because they're going to drive me across in a jeep across this sort of rifle range or something as part of the Norwegian army. And the thought that if I fell, I could break a leg and then the whole thing goes pear-shaped. And I could believe that there were trolls. Some of those boulders, they almost looked like they were moving on their own because it was misty and that sort of thing. And it's hard to argue against it when you're actually there on your own.
So ghost stories require death, don't they? And certainly, places where death is an ever-present, an ever-present threat
Yes.
seem to breed a lot of ghost stories. I think there's kind of interesting research involving fishermen in Newfoundland, actually, that those who fished in a safer environment had fewer ghost stories to tell than those that fished in a more dangerous environment. It's kind
Really?
of the proximity to death, the kind of danger they were involved in, and, directly led
Ah,
to more ghost stories as a kind of way of
gosh,
processing it, I guess. But I certainly
really?
think yeah, I think that the danger of the environments that you create kind of feels like it goes hand in hand with the ghost story. And I think as a
Mm.
reader, it becomes all the more unsettling as well. I've always felt the most unsettling thing for human beings is uncertainty. It's
Yes.
more unsettling than ghosts. If you kind of, if you can name the monster, it becomes less frightening. But
Yes.
that uncertainty permeates dark matter, doesn't it? I mean, there's a
Yeah.
reading of this book where ghosts don't exist, and it's all in Jack's mind.
There is. And the strange thing is that when I originally planned the book, and I'm one of those writers who plans, even though I know that it's going to change, and it always does change, but I planned it, and I was very definite with myself. The ghost exists. This is a real ghost. The dog sees it, other people see it. The ghost actually exists. Um, Maybe, there's a bit of psychosis with Jack because he's on his own, but the ghost exists. As I was writing it, though, the sort of psychological explanation came very much more to the fore. I think just partly because I was Jack, as I was getting more and more into his mind, and I that's the only way I can write about ghosts is if there is a psychological explanation as well as the other one that they actually exist. Um, that's it's strange. You can't really get away from that if you're a writer. I don't think. Um,
Where do you stand on it now, though? I feel like I spend a lot of time on Uncanny saying, "Do you believe in ghosts?" to people. But within the framing of the book, within the context of the book, do ghosts exist in this book? I mean, for you, are you convinced that there is something there, in that location, or is there? Are you open to an interpretation where it is all in the minds of our characters?
it is entirely possible that it is in his mind, but I feel, yeah. I mean, I think that I do feel that there is a ghost in dark matter.
Mhm.
That yeah, that the ghost actually there is an evil intent, or not evil, but a malevolent intent separate from Jack's mind. Um, Although that's just me, you see. So that's why I'm sort of hesitating and hedging it around, because what I also feel really strongly is that once I've written the book, it doesn't belong to me anymore. And it's been 15 years. I've had so many different responses to this book. It's really fascinating, and some readers are passionately of the view that it's a real ghost, and others just love the fact that it's all in his mind. Some of them really like Jack. Some of them think he's horrible. um, so the book becomes theirs, the story becomes theirs. Every reader creates a different story because they have, if they're gay, they're going to react, largely very positively. It's been lovely getting that sort of response from the LGBTQ, community. They might have a different response if they really hate dogs than if they like dogs, that sort of thing. So every reader has their own version of dark matter. So it doesn't really matter, I don't
That's
think.
probably the mark of a great work of art that people can bring so much of themselves to it and interpret in so many different ways. I mean, I definitely walk away from the book feeling that the ghost is real, I think. And I think,
Good.
I might have felt disappointed if I didn't feel like that. I think I wanted some sort of definite payoff at the end. But I mean, was it a conversation that you had with yourself during the writing process? Did you have different drafts where the ghost did or didn't exist, and where you sort of, I mean, did you feel a certain pressure to deliver what you felt was an actual sort of genuine supernatural
Oh no,
enter?
no, no. The only pressure I had was that I wanted to create a successfully frightening book. I wanted it to scare people. and to entertain, of course. And know that the drafts just became more and more frightening, I suppose, and more that the haunt, as I call it, came more to the fore because in the beginning it was a very accurate and rather dry account of this boy's own adventure in the Arctic, with a few sort of scary bits peppered around the place. But with each draft, I wanted to sort of permeate the entire book with a feeling of creeping dread, I suppose. Um,
Intriguing territory for me because I spend a lot of my life trying to frighten people as well, and I think
and very successfully, may I say, Danny?
there's not many of us that try and do that, that try and actually go out there and scare
Mm,
people, and it is a real, it's something you feel like music, isn't it? That kind of you feel the scares, the rhythms of how to scare somebody. What for
mm.
you was the breakthrough? What you said that the book started off as feeling too dry and not scary enough. What gave you that little touch paper that allowed you to feel this is a genuinely scary book?
I I wish I could say there was a sort of breakthrough moment. I think it was actually reading the first draft.
Hmm.
I'd rather melodramatically, I wrapped it up in black ribbon, a length of black satin ribbon. And then this was about sometime in September, I think. And then I opened it on Halloween and I read it, and
Great.
it was
This
utter
is a great
rubbish. It
example.
was real crap. It was just so boring and not scary.
I hope you had
Um,
candles lit around you as you read it.
Oh, well, almost, but it really was. You know, I've had that experience with first drafts before that, they're never as good as you think they are. But this was really rubbish. And so I think I just went back to my sort of principles of writing. I had I'd reread all of M.R. James and Edith Wharton and Rudyard Kipling and various others in the preparation for Dark Matter. And so I'd written myself on mauve paper. I'd written my sort of, these are the principles of a good ghost story. I'd sort of analyzed. I'd been quite analytical. So I went back to first principles. Just a lot of rewriting, but the idea that, and I think I picked that up from probably M.R. James, I mean, don't we all, that it's in the choice of language, that very specific, just his choice of just one strange word, a breathless, lungless laugh. It doesn't have to be much, but it's just that sort of, ooh, a cold kind of face pressed against mine. I mean, those are both M.R. James. You know, you can create fear or a creeping sense of dread when you're not dealing with the ghost. I think at one point in Dark Matter, Jack's cabin on board the Isbjorn is the size of a coffin. He just says, I, it's just that use of that word that sort of just creates a little. I call them grace notes, as in music. Just tiny little things, and that helped. That helped a lot. A lot of it was just hard work.
Is there one scene now that you look back on and sort of feel particularly frightened by, or you sort of feel, that's where the kind of, the symphony of scares really hits a peak.
You mean in the Dark Matter? I
Yeah,
think
yeah, yeah.
that the bear post was something that I didn't really know that, this idea of this having this post, a few feet away from the cabin, and trappers used to hang bits of rotting seal from it and then attract a polar bear, and then shoot it, Um, but this idea of the bear post was something that grew in the rewrite, and that was a direct result of the research trip in the winter, because I think I'd read about them in my Arctic reading, but I actually saw one in an exhibition, very luckily, in the beautiful little local museum in Longyearbyen, and and that started having a much bigger presence. And then I realized that was the focus of the haunt, because that was where this trapper had
I
been.
think it's an incredibly clever device in the book. I think that the way that
Thank
this
you.
object becomes so filled with menace, and I
Mm,
think for me it speaks to one of the most frightening things I come across in the kind of real life ghost stories I look at. That idea of your environment misbehaving, your environment seeming to do the impossible. You know, that you've got this kind of the parameters of your world, but then things start to behave. You know, paranormal is literally outside the normal. Things behave
Yeah.
in a way that is outside the normal. And this bear poster has been a kind of, a kind of, boring, kind of mundane object, a kind of relic
Yes.
of the past, suddenly becomes so infused with terror.
Well, that's the thing, and then it was great because also you just mention it to begin with, um, and then you start, and then it becomes
Mm.
a whole episode in itself. Quite a large section of the book as Jack becomes really fixated, and he knows it, and he sort of limits himself to, right, I'm only going to check the bear post 10 times a day, sort of thing. In other words, how
It's
is
a
it?
interesting moment that's where you feel him spiraling into that
You,
obsession and the idea
and
of
he
checking a
knows
post
it.
to see if it's moved. Yeah.
But it's interesting what you say about you know and that's an example. He knows that it's not really moved, but then it has. I mean, he measures
Mm.
it, and talking about sort of reality sort of rearranging itself. I mean, it's strange when you're writing fiction. I think you have to be stricter than in quotes real hauntings. I mean, the thing that popped into my mind when you were speaking was the hamsters, the dead hamsters in one of the episodes in Uncanny. When I forget the title of that episode, but one hamster is found dead. Well, that's bad enough. And then they get another one, and that's found dead. And then the third one. I was thinking about this, preparing for this. I would struggle I would hesitate rather to put dead hamsters in a fictional ghost story because the word hamster is comical, and it might be funny. But if it happens in real life to you, to your hamster, 3 times, I mean, that's going to change your whole view of the universe, isn't it? I mean, that's what's really scary about ghosts, isn't
And
it?
I,
I
I
mean,
think it's often the small things that scare people the most, the little
mm,
shifts in their fabric. And I think, you do that so cleverly in Dark Matter, the little shifts in Jack's world, the kind of, the things that kind of eat away at him slowly. Again, talking about this idea of creating fear.
mm,
I don't know how you feel about a comparison to Stephen King, but I think like both yourself and Stephen King are writers that have an ability to kind of leap from the page into your nightmares. I find that, reading
thank you.
books like Dark Matter, and also, I'm halfway through Rainforest, your new book at the moment. It's there's something troubling in a pleasurable way. It's a very enjoyable troubling, but it starts to get to you in your dreams, and I find I think about your books a lot as I'm reading them and afterwards. And I wondered, if that's true of you as well. I read a foreword by Stephen King for Pet Cemetery, where he talked about how he'd locked the book away in a drawer for months and actually debated over whether it was the right thing to do to release this work into the world, or if it was just too dark and disturbing. But have you had moments writing Dark Matter, or indeed any of your other books, where you have disturbed yourself, where you've frightened yourself?
Well, firstly, thank you for the comparison with Stephen King. I would be honoured to be mentioned. I mean, great. And Pet Cemetery is one of my favourites of his. I found that really scary.
Mm.
What was the question? I've lost
I mean,
track.
do you frighten yourself essentially?
Oh yeah,
I mean,
yeah. Do
Stephen
I?
King talked about how he frightened himself with
Yeah.
that book, about how he felt it came too close, too kind of personal. It sort of touched on things that scared him. Are there things within Dark Matter or your other books that have kind of scared you? Do you sometimes kind of lie awake at night thinking about some of the aspects of these books as you're writing them?
I have had disturbed nights. It's not a sort of direct thing. It tends to be more an unconscious unease. Um, when I'm actually writing, when I wrote Dark Matter and Thin Air, the others, Rainforest, um, I'm very much in the character's mind. Um, but occasionally, and I'm sure you know this from your writing, that occasionally you have to flip out and think, wait a minute, is this going on too long? Do we need a quiet bit? Do we need some action? Do we need some dialogue? How do I keep the reader reading on? Plant a little hook somewhere. So then you're a sort of omniscient, like an eagle looking down. I don't get scared when I'm doing that because I'm thinking, wait a minute, is this working? All that stuff. That's very objective. When I'm down on the ground with Jack, circling the cabin or something, or listening to that sound on the boardwalk, for some reason I find that very scary. The sort of the echoing of steps on the boardwalk, um, then I can get scared. But the disturbance tends to be more just on an unconscious level. I don't tend to have nightmares, but it's just disturbed sleep. I did a lot of rewriting of dark matter in the period between Christmas and or over Christmas and New Year. It's a lovely time. I love that time because you don't get emails from publishers, and but it's very intense, and I find rewriting very intense. Writing from scratch, I can do well. I used to be able to do before my mother got ill, for sort of a few hours, and then I think, oh, this is so difficult. Rewriting when I've got something to work on, I can do it for 10 hours a day if the condition is right. But then you really are in the mind of the protagonist, which isn't always a good place to be.
Jack's mind is a dark place to be, I think. I mean, is there a scene that was particularly tough to write? I think because I guess you get to know this character, and I get the sense from you were talking before about people's reactions to Jack and whether people like him or some people don't. But I get a sense that you have a great fondness for him. Was there a particularly tough scene to write as you kind of chart his descent?
Well, I think the climax was the toughest, because the rest of the book is a journal, so that actually creates its own difficulties or challenges in modern speak, because he can only be writing about what's already happened. And that's actually quite difficult to make scary, because the reader, every time there's a new entry, the reader knows that, well, he's all right because he's sitting in the cabin writing, isn't he? But when I came to the climax, then we changed the font to indicate to the reader that, okay, now we're just in Jack's mind, because obviously he can't be writing, the journal as it's happening. Nobody would do that.
Great point. Someone once said to me, a Hollywood producer once said to me, flashbacks aren't scary because you know your character's
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
And you actually pull off the opposite. I mean, like for the whole of this book, we think that Jack is not okay, and it feels absolutely terrifying as a result. And
And
then you have this kind of spectacularly surprising ending where sort of Jack is okay, but then not okay at the same time.
thank you.
It's. I mean, did you have that ending planned from the beginning? That idea that we assume Jack, and there are spoilers here, by the way, for anybody
There
who's
are going to
not
be
read the book. I'm
spoilers.
presuming
Yeah,
everybody watching this has read the book, but look away now if you haven't, and go and
yeah,
go read the
yeah.
book if you haven't. But did you have that ending plan that Jack does not do what we all think that he will do and die, that he's still around at the end?
I did know that Jack was going to survive, because personally, I just really don't like it when you've struggled with a character, and I would hope, actually, felt for him, and then they die at the end. Or even worse, in my view, oh, they turn out to be a ghost. I can't bear that. I haven't come across it well done anyway. There may well be ones. But so I knew he was going to survive. There I was being cold, hard planner. I was going to kill the dog all the
Oh,
way
really?
through. I was
Okay,
going to kill Isaac, because to me, that would be completely tragic, killing the husky. But then it never quite seemed to chime. And I thought, well, there are going to be people who think, oh, well, the dog dies, well, whatever, and that's not how I wanted people to feel at the end. And this was all in the first draft and the planning. And then it was only at that stage, I thought, well, who else who can I kill? And that was when I realized that Jack felt more than friendship for Gus. And I thought, yes, that's what's going to happen. And then that's also led me to realize that it was there already, but I hadn't brought it out that Jack is gay.
It's about Jack and Gus's relationship. That came relatively late in your process of
I
writing
knew they
that.
were going to be friends, but I didn't realize until I'd done the first draft that, and I hadn't nailed the climax, who dies and how. It was only then that I realized that actually it's been there all the time and I hadn't seen it. That Jack was gay, and then the whole thing that was lovely. It was one of those, you probably had it, that not a very big amount of rewriting creates a sort of seismic shift in the story and
Yeah,
just
yeah, yeah.
fits. It's just like the whole thing was there and it just needed a few little knocks, and then the whole thing fits, the pattern fits, and that was lovely.
It's exciting making those discoveries as a writer, isn't it?
It
And
is.
I've got to say, I'm very glad that Jack doesn't die because I think I don't know that I could have coped with the bleakness of
Yeah,
that. There's moments where you feel like you're being sucked into this horrible kind of this vision of madness, this kind of this thing where you feel like he's trapped not only by the environment but trapped by himself, and the
yeah.
fact that there is kind of some salvation, I think, is probably really important, as you say, for kind of all of us. We need these moments. Ghost stories can be
Yes.
quite dark, can't they? They deal in death. Death is the inevitable thing that you need for any ghost story, but to have some lightness there is important.
I think so. And for some reason, the image I always get is of sort of golden thread threading its way through the darkness.
Mm.
You need some light. And so, some human feeling, love for something, whether it's Gus, whether it's the relationship between Jack and the dog, which is very important, you know.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah, yeah.
Uh, but originally the dog was there because I thought, well, there's going to be no dialogue in the last half of the book, and
So the
that's
doctor.
hard work for
Yeah,
people.
yeah, yeah. It's a
Um,
clever idea.
mm,
I mean, it's interesting talking about these themes of light and darkness, which are so
mm,
kind of I was going to say polarized. We are literally in a pole. They're kind of so important here to this story.
mm.
I mean, you said I read in the new edition you've got some brilliant notes at the back of it, some sort of Q&As with you, and some insights into your process. I saw that you'd written there about having the title Dark Matter. I think 10 years before you wrote the book, you said, and you'd
Yeah,
found this interesting scientific concept of dark matter. I mean,
yeah.
there's of course many different ways to interpret those two words within the context of this book. I mean, now at the end of having written dark matter, what does dark matter mean to you within the context of this book?
Well, I always thought, and I still do, that it's a metaphor, for unseen forces, whether that's the unconscious or whether that's real ghosts, but things that exist and they're intangible, but they have powerful effects. So it's to me, it's a lovely. I mean, apart from being a good title, it's a wide-ranging metaphor because it can mean lots of things. It encompasses both the psychological interpretation of the haunt and the real one, the paranormal one. So and yeah, at one point, oh God, I remember um, towards the just before publication, they hadn't sort of finalized the cover yet and everything. I was in a bookshop and I saw a book called Dark Matter, a fiction book, and I thought, oh, Christ, we're going to have to change the title. Can't do that. And it was nothing to do with the story, my story. So okay, fair enough. And then Orion, somehow I discovered that there was another book coming out in a few months that they were publishing, and they hadn't sort of put two and two together and told me. So I thought I'm really going to have to change it. And then luckily the then head of Orion sort of we were in, I think, Frankfurt for the book fair or something like that, and he'd had a few drinks and he was sort of swaying gently and said, look, we just punch our way through, we just keep the title. And I was so relieved because um
Bloody good title. And when you've got a good
oh,
title, you don't have to change it, do you?
you don't
I
want to have
mean,
to change it, no.
sometimes it might sound sort of trivial, but sometimes having your title is the rock you build from, isn't it? The title
Totally.
just kind
it
of gives you that sense of what the book is about,
it,
and I
it
think,
was,
you know,
it absolutely was. And originally, I had the title Dark Matter. It was going to be set in the Atacama Desert. Took me a while to sort of head up north. But it should always have been Spitsbergen, really. Um,
no, it's great. Look, I would love to throw a few questions at you from people
yes,
watching, if that's okay. We've had a few people
lovely.
send us their questions. So I'm going to just kind of throw a few of these your way. The first one is
Please.
from Thomas, and he says, "What made you choose this period to set the novel in?" It's an incredibly evocative period as well. That kind of that moment of society about to be plunged back into another world war, still recovering from the first. What made you choose that period?
Oh, that's a great question, Tom. Some sort of technical aspects. I didn't want it to be too ancient, too old, like in the Victorian times, because I just thought that that would kind of the period detail might be a bit too much and distract from the central story. I didn't want it to be too modern, partly because I'm not that at ease in modern life anyway, but also then communicate. It'd be hard to isolate Jack, Certainly didn't want mobile phones and satellite and that sort of thing, because I want him to be really isolated.
They're the curse of any ghost story, aren't they? You don't want the trappings of the modern world in a ghost story.
Absolutely, absolutely. Then I hit a rock, or as I thought, because I suddenly thought, oh, I love, we're just talking about dark matter. And the concept, as I thought, because I hadn't read too much about it, had come up in the 1970s. And I thought, oh Christ, I don't want to set it then. Too much communication. But I did a bit more research, and thank God I really got lucky here because Fritz Zwicky, the Swiss guy who came up with the idea, his original paper was published in 1933, but nobody paid any attention to it. So I got lucky. I have always loved the 30s. I mean, you characterized it really well, Danny. It's a strange time,
Yeah.
and I
And
that
Thin Air is set around the same time as well. It's Thin Air
yeah,
like 1935, I think.
37.
Right, okay.
No, 35. You're
Yeah,
absolutely,
okay.
yeah.
Um,
Thank you,
but
thank you. You're
but
35. You're
I
absolutely
mean,
right. It's an interesting time.
yeah, I mean, I don't know if anybody's read the Haunting of Alma Fielding by Kate Summerscale, which is a real life ghost story
Yes,
set around that same period, the
really
30s
good.
as well. But she
Yeah,
talks in that about how there was a huge rise in poltergeist cases being
it
reported in
was.
the 30s as well,
Yes.
almost as if, kind of society was somehow going through some sort of collective, dark moment where it was
Well, they
actually
knew there was
manifesting
going
in
to be
this
another war.
activity.
I mean,
Yeah,
they,
yeah, and it was kind of
which is
manifesting almost in paranormal activity, if you want to kind of
absolutely, yeah.
read it that way.
Yeah.
Speaking of paranormal activity, Austin has a question. Have you yourself ever experienced a haunting?
I have, but not consciously.
No? Go
And
on.
I will explain. And it annoys me that I wasn't conscious, and I was very young. Um, I was actually a toddler. I was nearly 3. It was the night before my family left South Africa. I was born in Central Africa, as you said. We were due to embark on the boat. It was 6 weeks. This is 1963, so that's what it took. And we were staying, my parents, me, and my older sister, she was 5, with my great aunt and uncle. And they had an old house on the Cape in South Africa. And my mum had put me and my sister to bed. She'd gone down to the sitting room, and she heard footsteps in the bedroom, which was above the sitting room. So she'd quite cross, and she sort of came up, told us, no, we were both asleep. So she didn't have to tell us to be quiet. This happened again. She went down to the sitting room, and then a third time. And, we were really asleep. So eventually, Great Aunt Lily said, sorry, the house is haunted. But don't worry. It was the previous owner of the house. She was a lady who desperately wanted a child, had a little boy, who then, when he was a little boy, died. And ever since then, apparently, the ghost, if there's children in our house, she just comes and has a look at them. So don't worry, she said to my mother, who of course didn't sleep a wink the rest of the night. So that's my only brush with the paranormal.
That's not a bad brush. Do you feel
Well,
like you've carried
yeah.
this with you? Has that been a little part of your fascination with ghosts?
I was very proud of it when I was a child. I thought, well, at least, I've had that. I was also annoyed that I hadn't woken up and seen the
Mm.
ghost. I mean, there was one other, but I personally, being on the skeptical end of the spectrum, and it is a spectrum, I tend to think of it as a dream. But I was grown up. I chucked in the law. I was writing, and I woke up in my bedroom, and I saw a man standing in the bedroom, looking out of. He had his back to me, and he was looking out of my window. Something about the fact that he was so casual that he was just looking out the window. He was so assured. And for the moment that I woke up, I remember total panic, just thinking, this is really happening. this is happening. And then I woke up. So to me, that's a hypnagogic dream. That's one of the ones that you have when you're hallucination, when you're just about on the verge of waking up. But
And that's frightening potentially.
I'm getting frightened thinking about it because I do remember that thinking, this is what the thought was in my mind. This is really happening. Jesus
Yeah.
Christ, this is really happening.
Gosh.
So,
Very good answer. Well, this leads us into Keris's question quite well. In a world full of some very real horrors, what role do you feel ghost stories play?
oh wow. Yeah, the why do we like ghost stories
Yeah, yeah.
for
I mean,
those of us who
what is it
do?
about human beings that keeps exposing us to these stories? Because in a way, it's an odd thing, isn't it, to
Yeah.
read scary stories. My wife, I think I was telling you before
You
we
were saying
came
yes.
on the Zoom, my wife gets really frightened by ghost stories. She
Mm,
doesn't
mm,
listen to anything I do at all. And some
mm.
people would say, well, why the hell would you want to read a book that scares you? And yet, so many of us want to do that and find it deeply satisfying. Why? Why do humans do this to ourselves?
Well, I've thought about this a bit. I think there's a number of different, reasons. One might simply be that fear is pretty much the strongest emotion because it's what keeps us alive, in an evolutionary sense, and we like to feel. We like things that make us feel strongly.
Mm.
I think, you were talking about, those fishermen in Newfoundland sort of processing stuff. If something really if you experience a real haunting, it must be terrifying because not only during the haunt, but afterwards, I think some people on Uncanny have said, it wasn't so much seeing the ghost, it was the way I felt afterwards, that my
Yes, the
whole
way it changes your
worldview
worldview.
had
Yeah, yeah.
shifted. That's a real haunt. But if you're reading a book, you can sort of experience that if it's a good book, a good ghost story. But then you can control it, can't you? You can say, right, I'm actually going to put this down. I mean, I've had readers of Dark Matter say, no, I actually thought, I'm going to put that away and I'll read that tomorrow. Fine. And a lot of bad things in life we can't control, sadly, but we can control,
Yeah.
how often and under what conditions we read, or listen to Uncanny. Do I keep the light on or not? So I think there's that element of control. And then there was something that, sorry to keep going on about Uncanny, but it was one of the ones that Kieran O'Keefe actually mentioned, which I hadn't thought of. And it was a really interesting. And he talked about, we all want to escape the mundane life at times. And there's a need, I think, for the magical. And that I like that because it puts it in very basic sort of evolutionary terms. For some reason, human beings we like magic or the paranormal, I suppose. So whether it's fairy
Yeah,
stories
but
or
I mean, arguably, because the flip side is much scarier, isn't it? The idea of death really being the end and there being nothing beyond life is a potentially pretty terrifying concept in itself.
well, you see, that that kind of puzzles me because I find the opposite
Oh,
more
okay.
frightening. And that may be well because I've had, so far quite a nice life. I live in Wimbledon and, a nice country where women can do what they like and that sort of thing. Perhaps if I'd been a medieval peasant or someone in one of the war zones in the world today, I would find it terrifying, the thought that death is the end. But I actually find the idea of an afterlife pretty scary. The idea of just
Because
going
of what
on.
that might entail, that idea of
Exactly,
being, well, I mean,
exactly.
like the trapper, basically in Dark Matter, that
Yeah,
idea of being, well, he is the trapper who's trapped. He's this kind
he
of
is trapped.
horrible, kind of bleak
The
remnant
sight
of,
of his
yeah,
trauma, he's
yeah.
just there. How awful. And if I'm, well, when I die, if there's something of me left, that would include my capacity for boredom and loneliness and all the rest of it. And how do I deal with that? I mean, of course, all of these things. It's not black and white, is it? Maybe it exists for a bit, or maybe some people exist longer than others, or some people snuff out like a light and others don't. But I genuinely I'm on the side of thinking I'd prefer it to be like a light just going out, I think.
It's taking us into some very deep realms,
We
some
are indeed.
truly dark pictures. Let me throw one or two more questions at you. So Louis says, 15 years on since it was first published, has the novel changed for you at all? How was it to go back to this book 15 years on and do some sort of new extras for the end and just kind of reapproach it and be talking about it again?
Well, it's changed in a sense in that, and that's a fascinating question which I've never been asked before, Louis. So it's lovely to get a new one. Um, it's changed in the sense that I now it's almost filtered through all the different responses I get from readers, which is lovely. But I think, gosh, did they get that from my, that often happens with books. You don't necessarily consciously intend it. Um, I It was interesting because I reread it last night. I actually reread it. I don't normally read my books, but I thought I've got to prepare for this. I've actually got to, remind myself of what happens, and so I reread it. Stayed up quite late, um, and I was quite pleased. And I thought, oh, this is not bad actually. I think I'm more conscious of. I think I was younger and more confident in a way, and it was my first ghost story. Let's just go for it, hell for leather. I hadn't really thought from the ghost's point of view that much, and I hadn't thought, the deep stuff we were just talking about, Danny. I hadn't really thought about that. I was thinking more about the effect of a good scary haunt. Now, as I get older, I do think more about that. So if anything, I think my ghost stories are going to get darker.
Interesting, very interesting. The changes as we get older
Yeah,
ourselves. I think
yeah.
it's very true. Um, Hanneke has a question. The novel unfurls in numerous forms, letters and
Mm.
diaries. Why did you take that route versus a standard third-person narrative? Why do you particularly choose that kind of the diarizing model to tell the story?
A great question. I didn't to begin with. I had it um, straightforward first person narrative. And then something about it, I just decided, I think I'd got to about chapter 20. I got quite a long way through, and I thought, you know what, this is actually going to work so much better as a journal. And I think it may have been I'd reread Dracula. I do every few. I read it up in Whitby earlier this year. You have to in Whitby, um, and it was so brilliantly done. And the thing about a journal, I was saying, it's difficult because it's effectively a mini flashback each time. But on the other hand, you can they're always going to start off by saying, "I have seen it," and then that's the hook for that entry. And so it was quite laborious to rewrite as a journal, but it just seemed like the thing to do. And it did fit because they did write journals up there, and you've got a lot of time in the evenings. And it's so immediate, writing your diary, that you're really getting your own thoughts and feelings on the page, but there's also the possibility that someone else will read it. So
It's such a great way of both simultaneously being flashback and also feeling that you're very much in the present as well. Um,
exactly, yeah.
I've got three. We're sort of running out of time here, but there's
Um,
there's three questions I would love to chuck at you with kind of shortish answers.
quick.
I
Yeah.
think they're really good little quick fire questions here. Michael says, "What was the first book you read that made you scared?"
The Collected Ghost Stories of M.R. James.
Okay,
Yeah, still make me scared. Yes, Whistle and I'll Come to You, greatest ghost story ever written, I think.
I think for anyone who's not read M.R. James, I mean, it's a great
Mm,
place to go, isn't it, for kind of
it is.
grounding in the ghost story,
It
what the
is.
ghost story should be.
Yes, yes. Not just ghost stories, because a lot of them aren't really ghosts, they're just inhuman things, ominous things, in his
Mm.
words.
Yeah, I
Mm.
mean, interestingly, he road tested his stories by reading them out loud, didn't he? He used to always, he was a teacher at was he a teacher at Eton, I think, wasn't he? And he used to read his
Yes,
stories to his pupils to kind of
he,
see if they worked, how scary they were.
amazing, amazing.
Um,
That would have been amazing.
uh, and Matt says, after reading this, what should be next on our reading list? It's an interesting one to always chuck at you. Like, what ghost stories do you enjoy yourself now? Are there kind of other people working within the medium right now? M.R. James was obviously a long time ago. Is there
I
someone
know, I
around
know.
now that you like?
Um, Oh gosh, I don't want to sound ungenerous because there's a lot of gothic novels out there. Um, Sarah Moss, I think. I can't remember. I should have checked this, but Sarah Moss, Cold Earth. I did find that very atmospheric. Um, it's set in the far north as well. I'm afraid I do have to keep going back to the past. Edith Wharton, I think her collected ghost stories are masterful, some of them. I mean, one of the last stories she ever wrote was called All Souls, and that's really frightening and it's brilliant. Uh, yeah, I think I don't think I can think. I mean, Stephen King, yes, magnificent. Um,
Um, no, it's a good one. I'll give a tip. I'm going to recommend a book called Chasing the Dark
oh,
by a journalist called Ben Matchell, who is a journalist who works for the Times, and he's written this book that came out this summer, which is all about a guy called Tony Cornell, who was a sort of significant figure within the Society for Psychical Research, the world's kind of oldest and first ghost hunting group, and it kind of charts Tony Cornell's career and life, but in doing that, it charts the kind of the history of studying the paranormal, really, and kind of
ah,
why we chase the dark, why we try
yes.
and make sense of ghosts, and what it says about us as people. And it's a really interesting book. It's a non-fiction book, but it reads, in a kind of quite thrilling way, And so I would recommend that at the moment. I think for
And can I
anyone
just
who's
say,
interested in the subject.
for younger readers, Danny, your own book.
Oh, yeah.
Do you believe in ghosts? I mean, I read that a couple of nights ago, and I would have saved up all my pocket money for that when I was a kid
Oh, thank you.
because they
That's
just
great.
didn't exist, those sort of books. And there is now, I think that's the only one, isn't it? It's unique.
Well, that's very
So
kind. It's been very
it's,
interesting looking at ghost stories through children's eyes recently. I mean,
oh,
I
they
think,
love it.
like with you, my interest in writing, in ghost stories stemmed as a kid.
Yeah,
Began then.
yeah.
Um, which this brings us very well to the last question.
Oh,
Zoe's question here, not related to the book directly, but can you each please give us your top writing tips? What would you recommend, Michelle, if someone was interested in trying to write a book? I mean, I guess it doesn't have to be a ghost story, but
yeah,
maybe if they are interested in writing ghost stories. But do you have certain things that you feel have helped you
yeah.
be a writer, be a successful writer?
Well, a very basic one is carry a notebook, because you usually get your best ideas when you're walking or moving around. And if you don't write it down, if you're me, you forget it. It could be an idea for dialogue or story. Carry a notebook. Rewriting, I know that's boring, but it's really, really true. Good books are not written, they're rewritten, and that's when you really get to know stuff. But I think that the main one is write about what you love, what you really want to write about. Don't
I think
think,
that's so
I
important.
should write
Yeah.
this or, I shouldn't. If you get a little flicker of excitement, that's a good sign.
Yeah. So I think I would say write about something that you know about as well. I think the personal is so important. I
Yeah.
think, and that doesn't have to be obviously you taught yourself about the Arctic. You learned about it. I think authenticity is key.
Emotionally.
So I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
research is so key. But also there must be so many things from your personal life, your personal experience that flow
Yes.
into your books as well. I think
Yes.
when you draw on your own personal reservoir of experiences, I think that's when it rings most true. But I would also
Yeah.
say you know, good ideas are in short supply. And I think if you've got a good idea, then there is a great market for it out there. People want good ideas. People love
Yes.
reading good ideas. People
Yes.
love commissioning good ideas. If you're a book publisher, book editor, publisher out there. So I think, if you've got a good idea, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with the world, I would say. And
Yes.
get it down on paper and then show it to people. And their responses will help you realize if it truly is a good
Yes.
idea. I think,
I think that's absolutely right. You know, Forget the market, don't study the market. If an idea comes to you and there's nothing out there that's like it, fine, go for it.
Now we're running slightly over, but also I've been told that that's not a religious thing. We might be able to go slightly over. We've got 3 minutes over. Could we finish with you reading a little bit of the book to us, Michelle? I know that you
You could.
hoisted that possibility in front of me earlier on, and I said we would try and fit it in. I would love to hear. I'd love
Sure.
to end on a little bit of Michelle Paver reading this brilliant book, Dark Matter.
Okay. Well, I just happen to have a bit here. Um, yeah. we've just arrived at Gruhuken. It's midnight. It's the night of first dark. So the cabin's been built, and the Isbjorn, the ship, is just about to leave. And Jack's been up on the slopes, and he's coming back to camp. And as I said, it's the night of first dark. Twilight came on as I scrambled over the stones. The wind dropped to a whisper. I heard the creak of my anorak, my labouring breath. I was still 500 yards above camp when I saw a man standing in front of the cabin by the bear post. His back was turned, but I could tell it wasn't Algie or Gus. It must be one of the crew taking a last look at the cabin he'd helped to build. The sun was in my eyes, but I made out that he wasn't dressed like a sealer. Instead of overalls, he wore a tattered sheepskin coat and a round cap and ragged boots. I called out to him. "Hello there. You'd better get down to the boats. You'll be left behind." He turned to face me, a dark figure against the glare. Fleetingly, I saw that his hands were at his sides and that one shoulder was higher than the other. There was something about the tilt of his head that I didn't like. He didn't make an agreeable impression. All right, he made a disagreeable one. I wanted him away from my camp and safely heading for the ship. And irrationally, I wished I hadn't drawn attention to myself by calling out to him. Feeling foolish, I continued down the slope. I had to watch my footing. When I looked again, I was relieved to see that the man had gone. So it begins.
Thank you so much. The moment when Jack talks to a ghost makes that terrible decision to talk to a ghost. We all know that no good can
You
come of
shouldn't
that.
do that, no.
Look, that was brilliant. I felt myself spellbound and spine tingled there. Thank you so much, Michelle. As a fan of your work, it's been wonderful to talk to you tonight. I'm sure that many people watching and listening will have just been thrilled and so enjoyed hearing you talk about this brilliant book.
It's been my pleasure, a real honour as well to talk to you, Danny, and looking forward to the Halloween special.
Oh, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for joining us. Thank you and good night.